Welcome to Testaments of Faith, David, the king after God's own heart, Chapter 1. The divine choice, the boy God saw in the fields. Dust rose beneath Samuel's hurried steps as he approached Jesse's house in Bethlehem. The Lord had rejected Saul, and now the prophet was on a secret mission, to anoint Israel's next king. But Samuel did not know who God had chosen, only that it was one of Jesse's sons. The people of Israel wanted an imposing king, strong and commanding. But God did not see as man sees. Honored by the prophet's visit, Jesse called his sons. The first to appear was Eliab, tall, muscular, with the posture of a warrior. Samuel looked at him and thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." But God whispered to the prophet's heart, "Do not look at his appearance, for I have rejected him. Man sees the outward appearance, but I see the heart." One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, Abinadab, Shammah, and 4 more, but God rejected them all. Confused, Samuel asked, "Are these all your sons?" Jesse hesitated before answering, "There is still the youngest, David, tending the sheep." Samuel commanded them to send for him. Silence fell upon the house as David entered. He was young, simple in appearance, but his eyes burned with an uncommon fire. God spoke to Samuel, "This is the one. Rise and anoint him, for he is my chosen." The prophet took the horn of oil and, before all his brothers, poured it upon David's head. In that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and his life would never be the same. But no one imagined that Israel's future king would return to the fields the next day to tend his sheep once more. Chapter 2. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, the king without God's presence. The cold night wind blew over Saul's palace, yet the king found no rest. Since the Lord had rejected him, something inside him had changed. His spirit was restless, his mind tormented. Once, he had felt God's power guiding his steps, but now, a dark emptiness consumed him. The divine favor had departed, and in its place came a tormenting spirit that filled him with anguish and fear. His servants watched the king grow weaker by the day. His hands trembled, his eyes were lost in a void, and sudden fits of rage and despair overtook him without warning. Until one of his advisors suggested, "My lord, let us find a man skilled in playing the harp. When the tormenting spirit comes upon you, his music will bring relief." Saul nodded. He did not seek repentance. He merely wanted temporary relief from his suffering. The servants searched the land and found a name, David, the son of Jesse. When he entered the palace, no one realized the future king stood before them. With a harp in his hands, he strummed soft notes, and a supernatural peace filled the great hall. The darkness tormenting Saul faded away. For the first time in a long while, the king found rest. Yet, as he sat upon his throne, Saul did not realize that this young shepherd would one day take his place. Chapter 3. Goliath's Challenge. The giant versus God's chosen one. The sun burned over the valley of Elah, where 2 armies stood facing each other from afar. On one side, the Philistines, brutal and well-equipped warriors. On the other, Israel, a hesitant and fearful people. But the battle had not yet begun. Between the armies, a single man stepped forward, issuing a challenge that froze the blood of the Israelites. His name, Goliath. The Philistine giant stood nearly 3 meters tall. His armor gleamed under the sun, and his spear was so heavy that an ordinary man could hardly lift it. Every day, for 40 days, Goliath marched forward and mocked the army of Israel. "Where is your God? Where is a warrior brave enough to face me?" But no one dared to answer. King Saul, once a fearless warrior, now trembled alongside his people. Then David arrived at the camp. He was no soldier, just a young shepherd sent by his father to bring supplies to his brothers. But when he heard Goliath's words, something ignited within him. He looked around and saw the fear in the soldiers' faces. How could they allow a man to insult the living God? With conviction, David declared, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God? I will fight him myself." The soldiers laughed. How could a mere shepherd defeat a giant? But David did not trust in sword or spear. His confidence was in the Lord. Chapter 4. The battle against Goliath, the stone that brought down a giant. The laughter of the soldiers echoed through Israel's camp. David, a mere shepherd, claimed he would face Goliath. King Saul, still in disbelief, tried to dissuade him. "You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth." But David did not waver. "The Lord delivered me from the paws of the lion and the bear, and he will deliver me from this Philistine." With no other choice, Saul gave him his own armor, but as soon as David put it on, he realized he could not move. He did not need human armor. His strength came from the Lord. So David took his staff, his sling, and selected 5 smooth stones from the brook. With his eyes locked on the giant, he stepped onto the battlefield. Goliath looked at David and laughed. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks?" His thunderous voice made Israel's soldiers tremble. But David was unshaken. He lifted his voice and declared, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Today, the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel." Goliath's laughter faded, replaced by fury. He charged forward, sword raised, ready to crush the boy who dared defy him. But David did not wait. He ran toward the giant, swinging his sling, his eyes locked on his target. In an instant, the stone flew. The projectile cut through the air like an invisible arrow and embedded deep into Goliath's forehead. The giant staggered. His once arrogant eyes now reflected shock and fear. Then, like a collapsing tower, he fell to the ground with a thunderous crash. Silence hung over the valley for a moment before Israel's army erupted in victorious shouts. David rushed to the fallen body, drew Goliath's own sword, and with a single stroke ended the battle. That day, victory was not won by strength or military skill, but by the power of the living God. And with that, David's name resounded throughout all of Israel. Chapter 5. Saul's hatred, when jealousy becomes a curse. The battlefield was still marked by Goliath's fall. But while Israel rejoiced in victory, a dangerous feeling was born in King Saul's heart: jealousy. David was now the hero of Israel. The streets were filled with crowds chanting his name. But the final blow came with the songs of the women of Israel. Saul has slain thousands, but David tens of thousands. The king's smile vanished. Fury burned in his eyes. One thought consumed him: they give him more honor than me. What is left but my throne? In the following days, Saul could not hide his resentment. The tormenting spirit within him grew stronger. He spent sleepless nights, obsessed with David. Instead of ordering his execution, he made a more subtle decision. He placed David at the front of the most dangerous battles, hoping he would die at the hands of the Philistines. But the unexpected happened. David won every war he fought. The more Saul tried to get rid of him, the more God exalted him. The people adored him, and even the king's own son, Jonathan, became his closest friend. This only deepened Saul's fury. One evening, as David played the harp to soothe the king, Saul watched him in silence. His hatred grew like a raging storm, until, without warning, he grabbed his spear and hurled it at David with all his might. The blade sliced through the air, but at the last moment, David dodged, and the spear embedded itself in the wall behind him. The young warrior turned to see Saul, panting with rage. The mask of a benevolent king had fallen. Now, he was a man consumed by hatred. That night, David fled the palace, never looking back. He knew his life would never be the same again. Chapter 6. The fugitive of Israel, hunted by the king he once served. The cold wind swept over the hills of Israel. David ran, his heart pounding, his feet covered in dust. Once the hero of Israel, he was now a man marked for death. Saul would not rest until he was dead. The king sent messengers throughout the land, ordering David to be found. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a servant of the palace. He was a fugitive, hunted like an animal. David sought refuge in Nob, the city of priests. There he met Ahimelech, the high priest, who noticed his unease. "Why are you alone, David?" The young man glanced around, checking for pursuers. He could not tell the truth. "The king sent me on a secret mission," he replied. But he was not only seeking shelter, he was starving. Reluctantly, Ahimelech gave him the sacred bread from the tabernacle. David accepted, unaware that this meeting would have deadly consequences. Shortly after, David fled to a cave in Adullam, where his life changed forever. Discontented men, debtors, and outcasts began gathering around him. He, a fugitive, became the leader of an unlikely army. But Saul would not stop his pursuit. Enraged upon learning that the priests had aided David, the king ordered a massacre in Nob. No man, woman, or child was spared. Saul's name was now stained with the blood of the innocent. Yet, despite the shadow of death, David did not give up. His flight would continue, but God was with him. Chapter 7. The Spear and the Mercy. When David held Saul's life in his hands. The cold night air wrapped around the caves of En-Gedi, where David and his men were hiding. The wind whispered through the rocks, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Exhausted from his long pursuit, Saul entered the cave, unaware that David was already inside, watching his every move. David's men, their eyes wide with anticipation, saw the perfect opportunity. A hushed voice broke the silence. "This is the moment. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Kill him." But David stood still. His heart pounded. Moving cautiously, he drew his blade and, in a single motion, cut off a piece of Saul's robe. His hands trembled. Even though he was being hunted, even though he had every reason to strike, he could not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. Saul finished resting and stepped out of the cave, unaware of what had happened. Then, a powerful voice called out from behind him, "My Lord, the king." Saul turned and saw David standing atop a rock, holding the piece of cloth he had cut. "Today, the Lord delivered you into my hands, but I did not kill you." Saul's expression shifted. His once furious eyes now held confusion. David spoke again, his voice firm. "If I were your enemy, you would already be dead. Why do you continue to pursue me?" A heavy silence filled the valley. Saul lowered his head, feeling the weight of those words. For a moment, he seemed to see the truth. David was righteous. Tears streamed down the king's face. "You are more righteous than I, David." Saul's voice trembled. "Now I know you will be king, and the Lord will establish you over Israel." But even as he spoke, darkness still clung to him. Saul's heart was unstable, and his jealousy was a poison he could not purge. That day he returned to his palace, but the pursuit was far from over. David knew he could not trust Saul's words. The king of Israel was still consumed by his own downfall, and the young fugitive, who had refused to kill his enemy, would have to keep running for his life. Chapter 8. The Death of Saul, the End of a King Without God. The sun set over Mount Gilboa, painting the sky in shades of blood red. The battlefield was filled with chaos, screams of agony, and the clash of steel. The Philistines surged forward like an unstoppable storm, and the soldiers of Israel fell one by one. Among them stood Saul, the rejected king, the man who was once chosen but now faced the Lord's judgment. His hands trembled as he gripped his sword. He no longer felt God's presence. His heart was heavy, knowing this battle could not be won. The king of Israel was alone. Arrows whistled through the air like hunting birds, and one struck Saul with deadly force. The impact was brutal. His body staggered, his blood staining the earth. His eyes searched around, but no salvation came. His sons were dead, his warriors slaughtered. Desperation overtook him. He could not allow the Philistines to capture and humiliate him. Turning to his armor-bearer, he commanded in a weak voice, "Take your sword and end my life." But the young soldier hesitated, terrified at the thought of killing the king. Saul, consumed by pain and pride, took his own blade and, in a final act of despair, fell upon it. The king of Israel fell without honor. His lifeless body was a reminder of what happens when a man turns away from God. The news of his death spread quickly. When David heard, there was no celebration. He tore his clothes in mourning and wept for the man who had pursued him. "How the mighty have fallen," he lamented. Even knowing that Saul had sought his death, David did not see a defeated enemy. He saw a king who had lost everything, including the presence of the Lord. Now, the throne of Israel was empty, and the future of the kingdom was about to change forever. Chapter 9. The coronation of David, the shepherd who became king. The echoes of mourning for Saul's death still lingered over Israel. Without a king on the throne, the kingdom was divided and vulnerable. But amid the ruins of war, a new leader was rising, David, the chosen one of God. In Hebron, the elders of the tribe of Judah gathered and declared, "You are the Lord's anointed. Rule over us." David was crowned king of Judah, but the rest of Israel remained loyal to the house of Saul. The road to the throne would not be easy. Bloody battles and betrayals would shape his rise. But David did not rely on his sword. He trusted in God's promises. 4 years, civil war ravaged Israel. David fought against Saul's descendants while the throne remained divided. But slowly, his rule grew stronger. Mighty warriors joined him, and even those who once opposed him came to recognize his leadership. Then, one day, the news arrived. Ishbosheth, Saul's last heir, had been assassinated. Now, there was no one left from the royal line to challenge the throne. The leaders of the 12 tribes came to David and bowed before him. "You are our king, as the Lord has promised Israel." And in that moment, David was anointed king over the entire nation. His first act as king was to choose a place to establish his rule. Jerusalem, a fortified and strategic city, was in the hands of the Jebusites. Guided by the Lord, David led his men and conquered the city. From that day forward, Jerusalem became known as the City of David. But more important than the throne or the capital was the fact that the Lord was with him. The young shepherd, the fugitive, the warrior, was now the king of Israel. But his journey was far from over, for greater challenges and trials still lay ahead. Chapter 10. The Ark of the Covenant. God's presence returns to Israel. David gazed upon Jerusalem, the city that was now his capital. He knew that to truly rule Israel, he needed to restore what had been lost, the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the Lord's glory, had been forgotten in Kiriath Jearim for years. Without the Ark, Israel was incomplete. So the king gathered 30,000 men and marched to retrieve it. The city rejoiced. Trumpets sounded, and songs rose to the heavens. David led the procession, dancing before the Lord with all his might. But one mistake nearly turned the celebration into tragedy. The Levites placed the ark on an ox-drawn cart, disobeying God's command. Along the way, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah instinctively reached out to steady the Arkansas. At that moment, the Lord struck him down, and he fell dead. Fear spread among the people. David was shaken. How could he bring the ark without invoking God's wrath? In fear, He halted the journey and left the ark in the house of Obed-Edom. But over time, David saw that Obed-Edom prospered because God's presence was with him. The king realized his mistake. He had to bring the ark back, but this time the right way. With reverence and fear, David ordered the Levites to carry the ark on their shoulders, as God had commanded Moses. Every 6 steps, they sacrificed oxen and rams in honor of the Lord. The people celebrated even more joyfully. David danced, wearing only a linen ephod, unconcerned with his royal dignity. When they arrived in Jerusalem, the king offered burnt offerings and blessed the entire nation. But as the city rejoiced, Michal, David's wife, watched him with disdain. Her heart was hardened, seeing her husband not as a king, but as a man humbling himself before God. She did not realize that this surrender was what made David a man after God's own heart. Chapter 11. The Sin with Bathsheba, the Fall of a King. David's victories had secured his reign. Israel's army was unstoppable, and the king was beloved by his people. But when the time came for kings to go to war, David remained in Jerusalem. A small choice, yet a fatal one. The same man who had faced giants and armies would now face an enemy within, his own flesh. One evening, as he walked on the palace rooftop, David saw a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, a loyal warrior. Desire seized his heart. He could have any woman, but he wanted the one who belonged to another. And when desire grows greater than the fear of God, sin is at the door. David sent messengers to bring her to the palace. There, he gave in to temptation, and together they committed adultery. But the fleeting pleasure soon became a heavy burden. Days later, Bathsheba sent a message, "I am pregnant." David's heart pounded. His sin could not be discovered. To cover up his mistake, he summoned Uriah from battle, hoping he would return home to his wife. If Uriah lay with her, he would believe the child was his. But Uriah, a man of honor, refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his comrades fought on the battlefield. No manipulation worked. David realized he had to go further. In a dark decision, the king wrote a letter to Joab, the commander, "Place Uriah in the front lines where the battle is fiercest. Then withdraw." It was a death sentence. Ever loyal, Uriah carried his own execution order. In the heat of battle, he was placed in the deadliest spot, and the enemy struck him down. When the news reached David, he sighed in relief. Now, he could take Bathsheba as his wife, and the sin would be hidden. But what men could not see, God saw. The Lord was displeased. The king who once walked with God was now trying to conceal his transgressions, but no darkness could hide the truth from the Almighty. Chapter 12. Nathan's confrontation, God's judgment upon David. David's sin was hidden from men, but nothing could be concealed from God. The Lord sent the prophet Nathan to the palace, and with a stern look, he addressed the king. "O king, I must tell you a story." David, unaware of what was coming, listened intently. There were 2 men in a city. One was rich with many sheep and cattle. The other was poor and had only a single lamb, which he raised like a daughter. One day, a traveler came to the rich man, and instead of taking from his own flock, he took the poor man's only lamb and sacrificed it. Upon hearing this, David's anger burned within him. Rising from his throne, he shouted, "That man deserves to die." But then Nathan fixed his gaze upon him and declared, "You are that man." The weight of those words struck David like thunder. The prophet continued, "This is what the Lord says, I anointed you king over Israel and delivered you from Saul's hand. I gave you your master's house, and if that were too little, I would have given you even more. But you have despised the word of the Lord and taken Uriah's wife. Therefore, the sword will never depart from your house." David felt his strength drain away. The God who had always been with him now stood against him. He could no longer deny. He had sinned against the Lord. His eyes filled with tears. He did not justify himself, nor did he seek excuses. He simply fell to his knees and confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan looked at him and replied, "The Lord has forgiven your sin. You shall not die. But because you have given the enemies of God reason to blaspheme, the child born to you will die." David's heart shattered. He fasted, prayed, and lay on the ground, pleading for mercy. But after 7 days, the child died. His servants feared telling him, but he sensed it and asked, "Is the child dead?" When they nodded, David rose, washed his face, changed his clothes, and worshipped the Lord. The servants were puzzled. "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept, hoping that God might show mercy. But now he is gone, and I cannot bring him back." He learned that the consequence of sin is inevitable, but the grace of God was still greater. Chapter 13. Absalom's Rebellion. The son who turned against his father. Years passed, but Nathan's words still echoed, "The sword will never depart from your house." David's sin had cast a shadow over his family, and now judgment was beginning to unfold. Amnon, his firstborn, committed a terrible injustice against his sister Tamar, but David, consumed by guilt and weakness, did nothing to punish his son. His silence fueled hatred in the heart of Absalom, Tamar's brother. For 2 years, he harbored his anger, plotting revenge. Then, at a banquet, he set a trap and killed Amnon. Royal blood was spilled, and Absalom fled to save his own life. The exiled prince waited patiently for the right moment to strike. After 3 years in exile, David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem but refused to see him. The king's rejection only deepened the son's resentment. Absalom began conspiring against his father, winning the people's favor. Every day, he stood at the city gates, listening to grievances and saying, "If I were a judge in Israel, I would bring justice to all." Slowly, the people's loyalty shifted toward him. When the time was right, Absalom declared himself king in Hebron, and the people followed him. David, now a weakened king with little support, was forced to flee Jerusalem to save his life. His own son was now his enemy. History repeated itself. David, once a fugitive from Saul, was now a fugitive from his own son. He climbed the Mount of Olives weeping, covering his head and walking barefoot in sorrow. His company was small, and betrayal weighed heavily on him. But in his grief, he turned to God. "Perhaps the Lord will see my affliction and restore his favor to me." Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem as king, filled with arrogance. He saw himself as unstoppable, but he did not know that his downfall was near. For God had not forgotten David, and Absalom's judgment was already decreed. Chapter 14. The Fall of Absalom, the End of the Rebel Son. David's army reorganized in exile. His men were loyal, ready to restore the true king of Israel. Meanwhile, Absalom prepared for war, trusting in his popularity and arrogance. But David, though pursued, was still a father. He gave a clear order to his commanders, "Deal gently with the young man Absalom, for my sake." But war spares no one. The battle between Absalom's troops and David's warriors took place in the forest of Ephraim. And there, the fate of the rebellious son would be sealed. In the midst of battle, Absalom fled on horseback when his long hair became entangled in the branches of a great tree. The horse continued forward, leaving him dangling in the air, trapped among the limbs. His soldiers abandoned him, leaving him defenseless. When news reached Joab, David's commander, he did not hesitate. He took 3 javelins and thrust them into Absalom's heart. Other soldiers surrounded the fallen prince and struck him down until his life was gone. Absalom's army was crushed, and the survivors fled to their homes. Israel now knew the true king was still David. The news of Absalom's death reached the palace. David, expecting victory, fell to his knees upon hearing the fatal words, "Absalom is dead." His cries echoed through the halls, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." The victorious king wept like a defeated father. He knew his sin had brought judgment upon his house, and now he paid the highest price. But Israel needed its king. Joab, seeing his grief, rebuked him. "The people fought for you, yet you weep for your enemy?" Then David rose, wiped his tears, and returned to his throne. The king of Israel was restored, but his heart would forever bear the scar of loss. Chapter 15. The Final Challenge. David's last battle and his preparation for the end. Years passed, and David grew old. The scars of war and loss marked his soul. His reign had been glorious, but also filled with trials. He conquered lands, expanded Israel, and brought justice to his people, yet he never forgot his past mistakes. Even in his old age, the throne still faced threats. A new enemy arose from within his own house. Adonijah, his son, sought to seize the throne before its time. He gathered supporters and proclaimed himself king. David, weak and bedridden, had to make one final decision to ensure God's plan prevailed. The prophet Nathan and Bathsheba, now David's wife and Solomon's mother, went to the king to warn him of Adonijah's betrayal. They reminded David of his promise. Solomon was to be Israel's next king. Summoning his last strength, David ordered that Solomon be anointed publicly. The priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and the commander Benaiah led Solomon to Gihon, where he was anointed with holy oil. The sound of trumpets rang throughout Jerusalem. Long live King Solomon! Adonijah and his followers heard the shouts and knew their plan had failed. God's will had prevailed once again. Now, David knew his time had come. He called Solomon to his bedside and gave him his final instructions. Be strong and courageous, and keep the Lord's commandments. If you walk in God's ways, you will prosper, and Israel will stand firm forever. His gaze drifted into the past, remembering the shepherd boy he once was, the fugitive, the warrior, and the king. With a final breath, David rested. His body was laid to rest in the city of David, and his name became eternal among the kings of Israel. He was a man after God's own heart, not because he was perfect, but because, despite his failures, he always returned to the Lord. David's story teaches us that God does not seek perfection, but a repentant heart willing to change. From the fields of Bethlehem to the throne of Israel, David was a man who experienced the glory of God's presence, but also faced the consequences of his failures. He defeated giants, conquered kingdoms, and brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. But he also fell into sin, suffered betrayals, and lost sons. Yet, in every moment of failure, he always returned to the Lord. His story shows us that God never abandons those who seek him, and that his purpose is always fulfilled, no matter the circumstances. David is remembered not just as a great king, but as a man who deeply loved God. Even in his failures, he never turned away completely from the Lord's presence. When he sinned with Bathsheba, he did not justify himself. He fell to his knees and cried out for mercy. When he faced Absalom's rebellion, he did not seek revenge but entrusted his pain to the Almighty. And in his final days, when appointing Solomon as king, he reaffirmed his trust that God's will was greater than his own. David's true strength was not in his power, but in his dependence on the Lord. May we learn from David's story that God looks at the heart, not outward appearance, that sincere repentance brings restoration, and that even in our struggles, he never abandons us. Just as David was a man after God's own heart, we too can seek that intimacy with the Lord, trusting that he will guide and sustain us. His faithfulness endures forever, and his love is greater than our failures. David's story is not just about a king, but about a God who transforms lives. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content. Stay with God, and see you next time on Testaments of Faith. Thank you.